Usually when we talk about a historical narrative, there's this expectation of precision. It's treated almost like engineering.
Right, like it's a math equation.
Exactly. You look
Yeah.
at a timeline in a textbook, and it shows that neat, jagged black line, and the historian just points and says, there it is. That's when the battle happened. That's when the empire fell.
That's the day everyone changed their religion.
Right. And, I mean, it's comforting to view the past through that binary lens. We like things to be visible, to be categorized neatly into, like, before the event and after the event.
Well, yeah, we want to know the exact date a society shifted its worldview or, exactly how a specific military strategy conquered a continent. It makes for a clean story.
But then you step into the actual lived reality of the medieval and early modern Islamic world, and suddenly that historical X-ray machine is just completely broken.
Shattered.
Yeah, we're looking at a landscape of human behavior, of shifting beliefs, and these sprawling global economics that is incredibly murky. It just doesn't fit on a neat timeline. And that is exactly what we are getting into today.
Absolutely.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a stack of brilliant, incredibly dense academic sources and synthesizing them to uncover how this massive society, stretching from the Middle East to India and all the way to Indonesia, actually functioned on a day-to-day systemic level.
We're really trying to look past the dates and the names of kings here.
Yes, we are going to connect the dots between how a person actually changes their core religious beliefs, how an empire figures out how to fund a massive standing army of horse archers, and this is the crazy part, why the global economy has been draining silver into India for 2,000 years.
To do this, we're drawing on three foundational perspectives from our source materials.
Mm-hmm.
So we're utilizing Richard W. Bulliet's insights on the mechanics of religious conversion. We were looking at Reuven Amitai's analysis of the armies of Iran and the surrounding lands.
Focusing specifically on that tension between nomadic warriors and settled states, right?
Exactly. And finally, we are pulling from Scott C. Levi to understand the commercial structures and the macroeconomic currents that paid for all of it. The goal today is just to strip away the myths and look at the underlying systems of human behavior.
So let's start right at the foundation of this society, the operating system of faith.
That's a good way to put it.
When you read popular histories about the spread of Islam, especially in the medieval period, there is a very pervasive, very stubborn myth that you inevitably run into.
The conversion by the sword.
It's conversion by the sword stereotype.
Right.
The idea that a conquering army rolls into a town, points a weapon at the local population and says, change your religion right now or else.
Which is a stereotype that serious historical scholarship discarded decades ago. Yet it still lingers so heavily in the public consciousness.
It's everywhere in pop culture.
It really is. But what Richard Bulliet's work does is systematically dismantle the mechanics of that notion. He demonstrates that conversion to a major religion is almost never a simple on-off switch.
Right.
It certainly did not happen overnight, and force was, well, rarely the primary mechanism.
I was reading through the notes you provided on Bulliet's work, and what fascinated me was how he approaches this quantitatively. He doesn't look at it as some high-level theological debate.
No, not at all.
He looks at it as a model of innovation diffusion. He graphs it out like an S-shaped curve.
Yeah, the S-curve is essential for understanding how ideas move through a population. When a new religious identity enters a society, it starts out incredibly slow.
Just a flat line at the bottom.
Right. At the very bottom of that curve, you're in the early adoption phase. And you have to remember the environment we are talking about here. There is no mass media. Literacy is generally very low.
And the primary source of information is entirely word of mouth.
Exactly. It's just your neighbor talking to you over the fence,
Right.
or a merchant you trade with at the local market.
And in these early stages, language barriers have to slow things down even further, right? I mean, if an Arabic-speaking Muslim army conquers a Persian-speaking region, the theological nuances don't just translate immediately.
They absolutely don't. So the crucial early adopters in this model are often the bilingual offspring of interfaith marriages.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah. Under Islamic law, Muslim men could marry non-Muslim women, and the children of those unions were considered Muslim. These children grow up bilingual, and they are deeply embedded in both cultures from day one.
So they become the human bridges?
Precisely. They can speak the local language fluently, they understand the local customs perfectly, but they hold the new religious identity. They are equipped to explain the faith to their non-Muslim relatives, their cousins, their neighbors, in a way that an occupying soldier never could.
They're the networkers.
Exactly. They are the networkers. And as these bilingual, bicultural individuals slowly spread the concepts and practices of the faith, the network starts to grow. And this is where we hit the middle of Bulliet's S-curve.
The steep part.
The bandwagon phase. The momentum accelerates massively here. It becomes socially, culturally, or economically advantageous to join the new community.
Because your business prospects improve if you share the faith of the ruling class.
Right. Your social standing changes. You have better access to courts and legal protections. The conversion rate spikes dramatically, creating that steep upward line on the graph before eventually tapering off at the top as the number of people left to convert diminishes.
I love the mechanics of that, but I want to get really tangible for a second because the sources provide this incredible example from the work of Richard M. Eaton regarding East Bengal.
Oh, that's a brilliant case study.
This completely shattered my preconceived notions of how religious conversion actually happens on the ground. Because we aren't talking about scholars debating scripture in a grand marble mosque in Baghdad here. We're talking about illiterate rice farmers in a literal jungle.
Yes. East Bengal, during the Mughal period, provides a perfect look at the economic incentives driving cultural change. The Mughal government wanted to expand its agricultural tax base into the dense, uncultivated jungles of the Bengal Delta.
But the land was just swamp and tiger-infested jungle at this point. It wasn't producing anything they could tax.
Nothing at all. To make it profitable, the government utilized officials known as zamindars. These were essentially men who were granted the rights to collect revenues from specific tracts of land, provided they could actually make that land productive.
Right.
And to do that, the zamindars engaged local entrepreneurs. Now, some of these entrepreneurs were Hindu, but the vast majority were Muslim.
And these men were given land grants to go out into the Delta, establish new villages, build shrines, and organize the local tribal laborers to do the grueling heavy lifting of clearing the jungle.
And planting white rice, which is incredibly labor-intensive.
And here's where it gets really fascinating for me. The local tribal laborers didn't have a formalized institutional textbook religion.
No, they practiced indigenous animism.
Right, they worshipped local forest gods and river goddesses from their own traditions. But as they integrated into these brand new structured agricultural communities led by these charismatic Muslim entrepreneurs, they naturally began to adopt the religious identity of the person running the operation.
They were integrating into a new economic system, and the cultural system just came with it. But, and this is key, they didn't adopt a pristine, orthodox version of Islam exported directly from the Arabian Peninsula.
Not at all.
Eaton's research shows that the inhabitants of these new rice villages practiced a highly eclectic, heavily localized form of the faith. They brought their entire indigenous worldview with them into their new identity.
Give you an example of what that looked like.
Well, for instance, in some of these communities, the Prophet Muhammad was viewed almost as an avatar or an incarnation of a Hindu deity, like Vishnu.
Wow.
The local water spirits were rebranded as Islamic saints. It was a complete blending.
Think about it like adopting a new operating system for your computer. You don't just instantly become a power user of the new OS the second you install it.
Right, it's buggy at first.
Exactly. It's super buggy. You still try to use your old legacy apps, in this case, your local tribal deities or river spirits to get your daily tasks done. You kind of patch the two systems together so your daily life still runs smoothly.
That's a great analogy.
You might call the file folder Islam, but all the documents inside are still formatted in your indigenous belief system. It takes generations to fully update all the software, download all the new patches, and fully integrate into the orthodox system.
The concept of accommodation is central here. Islam, as a lived experience, changed based on where it was and who was adopting it. I mean, the faith of a conquering military elite in the 7th century Middle East looked vastly different from the eclectic syncretic faith of a 16th century rice farmer in the Bengal Delta.
If you're listening to this, you might be wondering why this matters so much. It matters because it reframes the entire motivation of history. If it wasn't forced by a sword at your throat, and it wasn't done purely as a cynical tax dodge to avoid the jizya, the tax on non-Muslims, then this massive cultural shift was largely about practical social networking, community building, and just economic survival on a changing frontier.
The assumption that new converts move cleanly from one perfectly defined belief system to another is historically inaccurate. Both the religion they are leaving and the religion they are joining are constantly shifting realities.
So that makes sense.
If you are the very first person in your village to convert, Your motivation and your experience of that religion are entirely different from the person who is the last to convert 300 years later, when the new faith has simply become the unshakable established tradition of the region.
Which brings up a really interesting question. This organic, localized spread of ideas didn't happen in a vacuum. It was incredibly messy, it was confusing, and people living through it needed to make sense of what was happening to their world.
They needed a narrative.
Right. We have these historical communities that are experiencing the collision of completely different worldviews. How did they process that? And that brings us to the stories they told themselves.
We can observe this processing mechanism by looking at the literary and institutional models of conversion, specifically shifting our focus to the Turkic societies of Central Asia.
Okay, let's go there.
The sources highlight the Golden Horde, which is a massive Mongol state established in southern Russia and the Caucasus, ruling over a largely Turkic nomadic population.
The narrative here centers on a ruler named Uzbek Khan in the early 14th century. And the literary sources from the region tell this wild, epic story about the moment he and his people converted to Islam.
It's quite the legend.
It really is. It involves a Sufi holy man, a mystic, named Baba Tuglas. According to the legend, Baba Tuglas and 3 other Muslims arrive at Uzbek Khan's coronation, and they immediately start disrupting the traditional indigenous rituals.
They are causing a huge scene.
Right. The Khan's spiritual advisors, the local shamans and diviners, are absolutely furious. They demand that these interlopers be executed for disrespecting the ancestral ways. But Uzbek Khan, being a pragmatic leader, decides to settle it with a test of spiritual power, a literal trial by fire.
The legend states they stoked 2 massive brick ovens, firing them with immense amounts of wood until they were just roaring with heat.
One oven for the Muslim mystic, Baba Tuglas, and one for the indigenous shaman.
Right.
The shaman is forced into his oven first, and he's instantly incinerated, just reduced to ash. But then it's Baba Tuglas' turn.
And then he puts on a suit of chainmail armor.
Yes, he puts on metal armor, steps directly into the blazing oven, and starts reciting his Sufi chant, his dhikr. And just to prove how hot the fire is, the Khan has a whole sheep hung over the top of the oven to cook.
They wait until the sheep is completely roasted, and then they open the heavy oven doors.
Out walks Baba Tuglas,
Unharmed.
wiping the sweat from his face. And he actually has the nerve to complain to the Khan. He says, "Why did you open the door so fast? I wasn't finished with my chants yet."
His chainmail armor is glowing red hot, but not a single hair on his body is singed.
And upon seeing this undeniable supernatural miracle, Uzbek Khan and his entire nomadic court instantly convert to Islam right then and there.
The imagery is incredibly potent. However, the analytical pivot here, drawing on the work of historian Devin DeWeese, is crucial.
Okay, lay it on me.
As historians analyzing systems of conversion, it fundamentally does not matter if this event actually happened.
Wait, you're telling me a guy in a suit of metal didn't survive a roasting oven while cooking a sheep?
I know it's a shock, but the historical factuality of the oven test is entirely beside the point. DeWeese argues that focusing on whether or not the miracle occurred blinds us to the actual historical value of the text.
So what's the real value?
What matters is the narrative response. These stories act as a collective cultural memory. We need to ask, how did communities that were experiencing the profound psychological stress of abandoning their ancestral gods to assimilate into a completely new foreign worldview talk about that process?
Ah, I see. So the story isn't meant to be a documentary film. It's a psychological processing tool for a massive cultural shift.
Precisely.
It's the community collectively saying, listen, our old ways were incredibly powerful, our shamans were strong, but this new way proved undeniably more powerful, and here's the symbolic, legendary story of how that transition happened so we can make sense of our new identity.
It creates a foundational myth for the new Islamic community that honors the spiritual stakes of the transition. It acknowledges the clash. And this wasn't just happening in the courts of Khans through legendary miracles either.
Right, it was happening on a grassroots level too.
If we look at the institutional models of how this faith solidified, we see networks of real people acting as the agents of this change over centuries. Sufi brotherhoods, traveling merchants, and wandering scholars formed an institutional web.
The source notes touch on Ajumardi Azra's work regarding Indonesia and China, which perfectly illustrates this institutional web. Earlier, we talked about those buggy operating systems, the early eclectic communities in places like Bengal or Java.
The ones blending the faiths.
Yeah, they identified as Muslim but heavily incorporated local animist or Hindu-Buddhist practices. But then you introduce these global institutional networks.
By the 17th century, you begin to see a significant phenomenon. Pilgrims and scholars from the fringes of the Islamic world, like Indonesia, undertaking the massive, dangerous journey to Mecca.
And they weren't just going for a quick pilgrimage, right?
No, many stayed and studied in the Arabian Peninsula for years. They immersed themselves in the formalized Orthodox theology of the heartland. And when they finally returned home to Southeast Asia, they brought back what was considered a more authoritative version of the faith.
They effectively served as human software updates.
That's a great way to put it.
They came back and started patching those buggy, accommodating, localized Islamic practices to align them more closely with the center of the Islamic world. They built schools, they translated Orthodox texts, and they tightened up the religious system.
The institutional network allowed the periphery to constantly recalibrate itself against the center.
I have to push back a little on how modern observers, and even some rigid historians, view this entire process. Because you read some accounts, or you hear modern religious purists talk, and they look at these 14th century Indonesian rice farmers or Central Asian nomads and dismiss them as nominal Muslims.
Right, the idea that they weren't authentic.
Like they weren't real Muslims because they still tied a prayer cloth to a sacred tree or mixed in some local animist practices. I think judging a 14th century frontier laborer by the rigid, formalized standards of 21st century textbook theology completely misunderstands human nature.
It's extremely anachronistic.
It misses the reality of how human beings actually experience and internalize cultural shifts.
Labeling them as merely nominal is academically lazy. I mean, if you look at the Muslim heartland itself in the 7th and 8th centuries, the Islam practice there was heavily influenced by pre-existing Byzantine and Sasanian administrative and cultural legacies.
Right.
It accommodated Hellenistic philosophy. So why wouldn't the Islam expanding into the jungles of India or the islands of Southeast Asia centuries later undergo its own localized process of accommodation? Knowledge and belief are always contextualized by the environment they enter.
Exactly. The environment dictates the shape of the system. And speaking of the environment, this organic, localized spread of ideas didn't happen in a vacuum. It was driven by the physical movement of people.
Merchants moving goods, scholars carrying texts.
But most importantly, it was driven by soldiers moving borders. The political stability and the shifting frontiers that allowed these religious and economic ideas to flow across continents were forged by a very specific, highly disruptive force.
Which necessitates our transition from the spread of faith to the mechanics of physical power. We need to look at the military evolution of the region. Specifically, what we can call the Seljuk dilemma.
Hackers versus corporate security. I have been waiting for this part.
It's one of the most fascinating dynamics of the era. To understand the military landscape of Iran and the surrounding lands from the 11th century onward, we have to look at the arrival of the Turkoman nomads, specifically under the leadership of the Seljuk family.
Okay, set the scene for us.
These were pastoral nomadic tribes emerging from the Eurasian steppe, crossing into the settled Islamic world. And they brought with them a style of warfare that completely upended the existing military paradigm.
Because they were essentially the ultimate light cavalry. I was digging through the supplemental notes you provided, and I found this quote from a 9th century Iraqi writer, al-Jahiz.
Yep.
He is describing the terrifying skill of the Turkish archer from the perspective of a settled urbanite, and it just blew my mind. He writes, quote, "The Turk shoots with his bow while he lets his mount go at full gallop, riding backwards and forwards, right and left, going up and down. The Turk has 4 eyes, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. He hits with his arrow when he faces backwards, as he does when he faces forward."
It is an incredibly vivid observation.
It sounds like a horror movie for a foot soldier.
It really was. The absolute hallmark of inter-Asian steppe warfare was the highly disciplined, coordinated use of masses of mounted archers. They possessed immense strategic mobility and overwhelming firepower.
Which the settled armies just didn't have.
Exactly. The standing armies of the settled Islamic states at the time were predominantly composed of infantry supported by heavier, slower cavalry. They simply could not cope with an enemy that refused to stand still and fight a conventional pitched battle.
Right.
In 1040, at the Battle of Dandakwan, an army of around 16,000 Seljuk Turkomans completely outmaneuvered and systematically dismantled a much larger, heavily equipped Ghaznavid standing army that even fielded war elephants.
Wait, how do light horses beat war elephants and heavy infantry? They basically just exhausted them, right?
Yes. They didn't charge the elephants directly.
That would be suicide.
Right. They let the heavily armored Ghaznavid standing army march out into the dry, unforgiving plain. They cut off their supply lines. They poisoned or guarded the water wells, and they just peppered them with arrows from a distance for days.
Just watch them collapse from thirst and exhaustion before moving in for the kill. It's a completely different operating system for warfare.
It is warfare based on mobility and attrition rather than holding ground. But here's the structural tension, the inherent dilemma of their success.
The what happens when the dog catches the car problem.
Exactly. The Seljuks win. They conquer Iran. They take control of Baghdad in 1055. Suddenly, these nomadic warlords, whose entire culture and military superiority is based on mobility and open pasture, are the rulers of a massive, settled agrarian empire.
With ancient cities and complex bureaucracies.
Right, and the goals of a nomadic army and the goals of a settled state are totally incompatible.
Diametrically opposed.
The nomads require vast tracts of open pasture to feed their massive herds of horses and sheep. They want to raid, they want booty, and they view borders as fluid. But the Seljuk rulers, who are now sitting in palaces in Isfahan or Baghdad running a government, want stability.
They need farmers to grow wheat and barley so the state can collect steady, predictable tax revenue.
And you cannot collect agricultural taxes if your cousin's flock of 50,000 sheep just trampled and ate the entire province's wheat harvest.
This is where the tech startup analogy comes in. I love this. Think about the Turkoman nomads like a team of rogue hacker founders.
Okay, let's hear it.
They are chaotic, they sleep under their desks, they ignore all the established rules of the industry, and they launch this incredibly disruptive tech product, their light cavalry tactics, that completely takes over the market. They conquer the industry.
They win.
They win, but then the startup goes public. It becomes a massive, settled corporate empire.
And the requirements for running a massive corporation are very different from the requirements for launching a disruptive startup.
Exactly. The CEO, the Saldashik Sultan, realizes that he cannot have these chaotic hackers running around the new corporate headquarters, pulling pranks, ignoring HR, and disrupting the daily accounting. It's terrible for the stock price.
Or in this case, the agricultural tax base.
Right. But he can't just fire them because they are his family, they're his core base of power, and they are incredibly dangerous. So what does he do? He banishes the hackers to a remote R&D offsite.
In historical terms, the Seljuk state deliberately pushed the bulk of their own Turkoman nomadic supporters to the far frontiers of the empire, specifically directing them toward Azerbaijan and Anatolia to wage holy war against the Byzantine Empire.
Go disrupt the Byzantine market, guys. Have fun in Anatolia.
They provided them with a new target, new lands to raid, and most importantly, got them far away from the fragile, vital agricultural centers of Iran and Iraq.
But once you banish your hackers, who protects the corporate headquarters? The CEO still needs security. He has to hire a professional, rigid, highly disciplined corporate security team that will actually follow orders and respect the company hierarchy.
And in the medieval Islamic world, that corporate security team was built through the institution of military slavery, the Mamluks, or Ghilman.
Tell us about them.
The Seljuk rulers, guided by brilliant Persian bureaucratic administrators like Nizam al-Mulk, began building a standing army of professional Turkish military slaves. These were young boys purchased or captured from the Eurasian steppes, brought deep into the empire, converted to Islam, and trained rigorously in a settled professional military environment.
So they were ethnically Turks, just like the nomads on the frontier.
Yes, so they possessed the inherent cultural martial skill with horses and bows. But because they were severed from their families at a young age, they had the discipline and loyalty of a professional payroll.
They didn't have competing tribal loyalties.
Exactly. Their loyalty was entirely to the Sultan who bought them, trained them, educated them, and eventually freed them to serve as officers. The psychological bond forged between the master and the Mamluk, and among the Mamluks themselves who trained together, was intentionally designed to replace the biological ties of the nomadic tribe.
It's an incredible system.
It is. However, if we look at the mechanics of this system, a massive logistical problem immediately emerges. The budget. How do you pay for a professional standing army of 10 to 15,000 elite, heavily armed cavalrymen without bankrupting the state treasury? Because these Mamluks aren't out on the frontier raiding for booty. They are garrisoned in the cities.
Right. Corporate security wants a 401k. dental benefits, and a steady biweekly paycheck.
They require steady salaries, high-quality weapons, and massive amounts of fodder for their horses, and the central treasury was chronically cash poor.
So how did they solve it?
The administrative solution they widely utilized and formalized was the Akisa system. Now, it is absolutely crucial to state that this was not European feudalism, though it is often mistakenly compared to it.
How is it different?
Under the Akisa system, the state did not give away the ownership of the land to the soldier. The state retained ownership. Instead, the government allocated the rights to collect the agricultural tax revenue from a specific parcel of land directly to a military officer.
Okay, so instead of the Persian peasant farmer paying his taxes to a government bureaucrat, who then sends the silver to the treasury in Baghdad, who then eventually pays the Turkish general his salary, the state just cuts out the middleman.
Precisely.
The farmer just pays his taxes directly to the general.
The military officer, known as the Mukwa, goes to his signed region, collects the harvest surplus or the silver directly from the peasantry, and keeps that revenue to maintain himself, his household, and his regiment of troops.
And what does the state get in return?
He then owes the Sultan military service when called upon. It was an ingenious, if structurally risky, administrative workaround. It fundamentally tied the sustenance of military power directly to the localized agricultural economics of the empire.
It's an elegant, interconnected system. The hackers are out on the frontier fighting the Byzantines and expanding the borders. The corporate security Mamluks are guarding the capital and maintaining internal order. And the farmers are directly funding the security team through the Ecord grants.
It balances the nomadic threat with the agrarian reality perfectly.
It works brilliantly right up until it gets absolutely obliterated by the largest, most disciplined nomadic force the world had ever seen. Which brings us to the arrival of the Mongol machine.
Yes. In the 13th century, the armies of Chinggis Khan, and later his grandson Hulagu, roll into the Islamic world. And if the Seljuk Turkomans were a disruptive force, the Mongols were an apocalyptic paradigm shift.
The scale is just hard to comprehend.
We are talking about armies eventually numbering well over 100,000 troops, operating with a level of strategic coordination and discipline that was unprecedented in human history.
Let's look at the mechanics of this machine, because they didn't just win by having more guys on horses. It was an entirely different system of organization. I was reading the accounts in your notes from European envoys, specifically the Franciscan friar John of Plano Carpini in 1246.
He actually traveled to the Mongol court and observed their tactics firsthand.
Yeah. They operated almost entirely as light cavalry, and their primary battlefield strategy relied on wave attacks. They would approach the enemy line, unleash 3 or 4 arrows per man in a devastating barrage, and then immediately wheel away, letting the next wave cycle in to fire.
It's a continuous, rotating barrage of concentrated firepower.
It's like the caracole maneuver, where centuries later, European cavalry with pistols would ride up to an infantry square, fire their guns, and immediately peel away to the back of the formation to reload while the next row moved up to fire.
Similar concept, yes.
But the Mongols were doing this with composite bows at a full gallop, just relentlessly grinding the enemy down.
And they were legendary for the feigned retreat.
Oh, this is ruthless.
They would break formation and run, pretending to flee the battlefield in total panic. The enemy forces, thinking they had broken the Mongol line and won the day, would inevitably break their own disciplined formation and charge forward in chaotic pursuit.
And once the enemy was strung out and disorganized,
the Mongols would seamlessly turn around in the saddle, shooting backward with devastating accuracy. Just as El-Jahiz described the Turks doing centuries earlier, draw the enemy into a prearranged ambush and slaughter them.
And Carpini noted that they absolutely avoided close quarters, hand-to-hand combat until the enemy's horses and men were completely exhausted and disorganized by the arrow storms.
It was clinical.
But it wasn't just battlefield tactics. You do not manage 100,000 horsemen operating across thousands of miles with just good archery and fake retreats. The secret sauce of the Mongol military machine was social engineering.
Absolutely. The Mongols implemented a strict decimal system of organization. Squads of 10 men, companies of 100, brigades of 1,000, all the way up to massive divisions of 10,000 men, called a tumen.
Now, other steppe empires had used basic decimal structures before.
They had, but Chinggis Khan did something revolutionary with it. He used it to deliberately break up the traditional nomadic tribes. When he conquered a new tribe on the steppe, he didn't just absorb them as a unit, he scattered them.
He broke them apart.
He took men from one tribe and mixed them into squads with men from 3 other rival tribes. He deliberately scrambled the entire nomadic population to shatter their old ancestral loyalties.
He rewrote their social operating system. If you're a nomadic warrior, your loyalty is no longer to the chief of the tribe your grandfather belonged to. Your loyalty is to your squad leader, your two-man commander, and ultimately, absolute loyalty to the Khan.
He replaced biological ties with mechanical military ties.
And to ensure unity and prevent rebellion across the vast new empire they were building, they developed the Tama system.
Yes, the Tama forces. These were specialized expeditionary forces stationed on the frontiers. The genius of the Tama was that it deliberately pulled soldiers from the contingents of all the different branches of the Mongol royal family.
Which spreads the military burden of garrison duty, sure.
But more importantly, it functioned as an institutionalized hostage system. If every major Mongol prince has thousands of his own troops integrated into a vanguard army hundreds of miles away under the command of the Great Khan, no one is going to attempt a rebellion back at home.
Their own men are effectively hostages to the system. It's brilliant. Okay, but this raises a huge historical debate that the source materials dive into.
The Mamluk conflict.
Right. The Mongols conquer Central Asia, they conquer Iran, they completely sack Baghdad in 1258, and they push into Syria. They seem completely unstoppable, but then they stop.
They face the Mamluks of Egypt.
The ultimate professional corporate security slave army we just talked about. And the Mongols fail to conquer them, they lose at Angelut, and they never manage to take Egypt. Why did the machine break down?
This is a point of intense and fascinating academic debate between historians like David Morgan and John Masson Smith Jr.
Give us the breakdown.
Well, Smith makes a very compelling argument that the Mongols were stymied primarily by logistical failures, not necessarily military inferiority in a vacuum. His argument centers on the environment. Syria simply did not have the carrying capacity, the pasture and water to support the massive herds of horses the Mongols brought with them.
Because you have to remember, a Mongol soldier didn't just have one horse.
No, he traveled with a string of 5 or 6 remounts to maintain that incredible strategic mobility.
So an army of 50,000 men brings 300,000 horses into the Middle East.
Exactly. And as the intense Syrian summer approached, the grasslands dried up. The water sources were insufficient. Smith argues that the Mongols literally could not keep their massive army in the region.
So what did they do?
They had to withdraw the bulk of their forces back to the richer pastures of Azerbaijan or Iran, leaving only a smaller garrison force behind. And it was this smaller, heavily outnumbered force that the heavily armored, highly trained Mamluk professionals defeated.
Okay, that makes sense logistically.
But Smith goes further. He suggests the Mongols were essentially inferior amateurs who relied primarily on overwhelming numbers and mobility. And when denied those advantages by geography, they fell apart against the Mamluk professionals.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back vehemently on this inferior amateur label. I get the logistical argument, but you do not accidentally conquer the known world from the coast of China to the borders of Eastern Europe by being a disorganized amateur.
Well, hold on. Smith makes a compelling point regarding the pure physics of logistics. If you bring hundreds of thousands of horses into a Syrian summer, they're going to starve. The Mamluks, being a standing army based in the region, didn't have that problem.
Right, they had home field advantage.
They were operating on their home turf with localized supply lines. Smith is not entirely wrong about the inherent environmental limitations of a purely nomadic military machine trying to occupy a hot, arid, settled zone.
I concede the logistics, but our main source author, Reuven Amitai, agrees that calling them amateurs goes way too far.
Amitai does push back on Smith, yes.
Amitai points out that Smith's view is too geographically deterministic. The grasslands of Syria were far from fully exploited by the Mongols. They could have managed smaller, sustained campaigns better. Furthermore, the Mongols didn't just try once and give up.
No, they kept coming back, fighting the Mamluks for another 60 years.
Exactly. If it was purely a geographic impossibility, a machine that pragmatic would have realized it and stopped wasting resources. The Mongols weren't amateurs. They were fighting a highly specialized, ruthlessly efficient form of warfare. Facing a Mongol Tumen was like facing a modern mechanized infantry unit.
Operating with mechanical precision.
But made entirely of biological components, horses, and arrows.
It is a fair assessment.
Yeah.
The friction between the two systems, the nomadic wave versus the settled professional Mamluk garrison, defined the geopolitical borders of the Middle East for a century.
But this brings up the fundamental economic question again. How on earth did the Mongol Empire pay for all of this? The Seljuks needed to invent the complex ecosystem to pay their standing army. Did the Mongols suddenly settle down and become farmers to manage the economies of the vast lands they conquered?
Did they start auditing tax returns in Baghdad?
Yeah, exactly.
They most certainly did not. And this debunks another lingering myth. There's a famous passage from the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, who was working for the Mongols, that suggested Mongol soldiers suddenly wanted to settle down, take up agriculture, and become farmers in Iran.
I can't picture a Mongol warrior planting wheat.
Neither could they. As the contemporary Arab writer al-Umari noted, the Mongols remained fundamentally nomadic. They despised the settled life. They didn't want to farm the land. They wanted the wealth that the farms produced. They wanted the revenue.
They wanted the dividend checks from the corporation, but they didn't want to work on the assembly line.
Exactly. For the ordinary Mongol rank-and-file soldier, military service wasn't a paid profession like the Mamluks. It was a traditional obligation to the ruler. In fact, ordinary Mongol nomads actually paid taxes to the Khan, like the kubchur, which was a tax on their livestock herds.
Wait, the soldiers paid the government?
Yes, but the Mongol leadership, the royal family, and the top commanders controlled vast swaths of agricultural land across Iran and Central Asia. They used native bureaucrats to extract the surplus wealth, the silver and the grain from the settled peasant populations, and funneled that wealth upward.
To fund the elite levels of their nomadic military machine and their imperial courts.
Precisely.
So, if we look at the big picture here, we have these massive military empires, the Seljuks, the Mongols, and later Turkic states like the Timurids, and they are all extracting unimaginable wealth from the land, the peasants, and the trade routes to fund these massive armies of cavalry.
Huge amounts of wealth.
But where is all this liquid wealth ultimately coming from, and where is it going? This perfectly connects us to the macroeconomic reality of the era, the global sinkhole of silver.
To truly understand how these empires were sustained, how they afforded the armies and the courts, we have to pull back and look at the macroeconomic currents of the entire globe.
The big map.
The really big map. Because the defining feature of the Eastern Islamic and Indian commercial structure for nearly 2 millennia was the continuous massive eastward movement of precious metals.
If you're listening to this, you're probably thinking about modern economics. We talk constantly today about trade deficits, about manufacturing hubs, about the flow of capital between East and West.
It feels like a very modern conversation.
I love this section because it shows that globalization is not a new concept. We are talking about massive, structural trade deficits in the ancient and medieval world.
The sources provide a striking example by quoting Pliny the Elder, a Roman author and philosopher writing in the 1st century CE.
Good old Pliny.
He was bitterly complaining in his writings that the Roman Empire was financially bleeding to death, draining its wealth to India.
Bleeding to death.
He estimated that no less than 550 million sesterces, an astronomical sum of silver and gold, were being lost to the Indian subcontinent every single year in exchange for luxury merchandise, primarily fine cotton textiles from regions like Beria Gaza, along with spices and silks.
He was basically writing an angry op-ed saying, "We are buying too many Indian t-shirts and it's ruining the Roman economy. We are sending all our hard currency overseas."
In essence, yes, Rome was suffering a massive structural trade deficit. The problem was that the manufactured goods Rome wanted from India, the high-quality textiles and spices, were far more valuable and in higher demand than anything Rome produced that India actually wanted to buy.
And since India didn't want Roman goods in exchange,
Rome had to balance the trade deficit by paying the difference in hard cash, in silver and gold bullion.
And what blows my mind is the sheer historical continuity of this dynamic. Fast forward 1,600 years from Pliny the Elder, the Roman Empire is long gone, the map has completely changed.
Right, but the economic current remains identical.
That is wild.
We look at the accounts of early modern European travelers in the 17th century, men like Nicolas Manucci and the French physician François Bernier. They are traveling through Mughal India, and they are observing the exact same macroeconomic phenomena.
What were they seeing?
European trading companies, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, are sailing to India, and what are they bringing? They are bringing massive amounts of silver that has been freshly mined in the Americas.
From the New World.
They're shipping New World silver across the oceans to India, and they're exchanging it for Indian cotton textiles, indigo for dyes, opium, and silk. Bernier literally wrote in his travelogues that gold and silver, after circulating everywhere else in the world, comes at last to be swallowed up in India.
There is this incredible, evocative quote in the reading from a French monk, Raphael Dumons, writing in 1660. He was trying to describe the economy of Safavid Persia, which sat right between Europe and India.
The caravanserai analogy.
Yes. He compared the entire empire of Persia to a massive caravanserai, a roadside inn for merchants with two doors. He said silver enters through the western door, coming from Europe and the Ottoman Empire, and it exits through the eastern door into India, quote, where all the money in the universe is unloaded as if into an abyss.
An abyss of silver.
India was the ultimate global sinkhole of silver.
Because India had a massive population, highly advanced manufacturing capabilities, particularly the cotton loom, but it lacked significant domestic reserves of silver and gold in its own soil.
So they needed the cash.
Therefore, foreign merchants who showed up with raw silver bullion had massive purchasing power. The Indian economy absorbed it endlessly to monetize its own internal markets.
So how does this all tie back into the armies and the religion we've been talking about? We talked about the Seljuks pushing hackers to the frontier, the Mongols implementing decimal systems, the Mamluk slave armies needing their salaries paid through ikta grants.
They were all sitting geographically right in the middle of this massive, unstoppable highway of global wealth flowing from west to east.
How did this insatiable Indian demand for silver shape the Middle Eastern empires?
It shaped their fundamental nature as states, because the Islamic empires situated between Europe and India, in Iran, Central Asia, and the Middle East, acted as the great geographic conduits of this transcontinental trade. And more importantly for their survival, they acted as the great toll collectors.
They were the ultimate middlemen. You want to get your European silver to the Indian abyss, you have to walk through our caravanserai, and we are going to charge you at both doors.
Precisely. The agricultural wealth we discussed, the revenues from the key systems that funded the Mamluk slave armies, the immense tribute extracted by the Mongol Tumans.
It wasn't just farming.
No. Much of the liquid wealth underpinning these agrarian systems was heavily supplemented by taxing and facilitating this massive transcontinental flow of goods and silver. The urban centers of the Islamic world thrived by servicing this trade.
The global trade deficit of the West directly helped fund the nomadic cavalry, the standing armies, and the grand mosques of the Islamic world.
The military and religious institutions did not exist in isolation. They were floating on a river of silver heading to India.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together because what an incredible journey we've been on today. We started by dismantling the simplistic myth of conversion by the sword.
We saw how a massive religious shift actually happens on the ground.
Right. Through the S-curves of social networking, bilingual families, and economic incentives, we saw how Bengali rice farmers adapted Islam to fit their local worldview, creating a buggy but functional cultural operating system.
We saw how societies processed the psychological trauma of these massive cultural collisions through shared legends. Stories like Baba Tukul's emerging unharmed from the blazing oven weren't just tall tales.
No, they served as vital narrative coping mechanisms for communities undergoing profound identity changes, which were later updated and formalized by institutional networks stretching all the way to Mecca.
Then we watched as the terrifying mobility of nomadic horsemen out of the Eurasian steppe forced settled agrarian empires to completely reinvent themselves.
To survive, they had to invent complex administrative workarounds like the Ikita tax revenue grants and professional, corporatized Mamluk slave armies just to keep their governments from collapsing under the weight of their own nomadic founders.
We explored the terrifying mechanized precision of the Mongol military machine and debated whether logistics or Mamluk steel finally halted their advance.
And finally, we tracked the macroeconomic reality that underpinned every single soldier, scholar, and sultan we discussed: the global flow of silver.
We discovered that for 2,000 years, despite the rise and fall of caliphates and khans, the ultimate destination of global wealth was the manufacturing abyss of India.
It fundamentally changes how you look at the world, doesn't it? It proves that history isn't a neat, jagged line on a timeline. It's a massive, messy web, which leaves you with a final thought to mull over.
Something to think about.
We tend to think of globalization, of massive trade deficits and the shifting of global wealth as this very modern, Western-driven phenomenon. We think it's a product of the 20th and 21st centuries. But what if the true historical gravity of global wealth and cultural integration has almost always pulled east?
It's a heavy thought.
If Pliny the Elder was complaining about devastating trade deficits with India 2 millennia ago, maybe our modern global economy isn't a new invention at all. Maybe it's just the latest patch, the newest version of an ancient operating system that has been running quietly in the background of human history all along.
When you look past the binary dates and examine the deep structures, the systems that drive human behavior, ambition, and commerce remain remarkably, undeniably consistent.
And suddenly that historical X-ray isn't just a murky, broken picture. It's a vibrant, incredibly complex tapestry. And every single thread, from a fiery oven in Russia to a silver coin in Rome, is connected. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems that run the world, and we'll see you next time.